Hi, I'm Jen, and welcome to week 1 of Making Space to Make. If you missed the introduction to this series, I'll pop a link in the description below. Before we dive into organizing anything, I want to start with a question that's very important to this entire series. How do you actually sew? And I don't mean how you think you should sew or how you might want things to look based on what you've seen on social media. And I know, I think about that all the time having a sewing business. But how do you really work? Where, when, and what kinds of projects? You'll want to be honest about this because organizing solutions that work for someone who sews for 2 hours every Saturday morning are probably a bit different from what works for someone who grabs 20 minutes here and there whenever they can. So this week, we're just going to notice our patterns. We're going to take an honest look at our actual sewing practices so that when we start organizing, we can set up realistic systems that work for how we actually sew. So with that, let's get into it. First, let's talk about where you sew, and I mean the physical space, not whether you think it's good enough, organized enough, or how you wish it looked or functioned. Just what's actually happening right now. Some of you have dedicated sewing rooms. Some of you are sewing at the dining table. Some of you maybe have a corner of the bedroom or a closet you've converted. Or you're portable and you move around the house. I want to reiterate that this series is not about assigning value to one way of working over any other. None of these is better or worse. They're just different, and because of that, they need different solutions. When you're thinking about your space, I want you to consider the following questions and make a note of what your answers are. Is this space just for sewing, or is it shared multipurpose? Do you leave your machine set up in a designated space, or do you put it away each time? Do you have storage in the same space where you sew, a specific spot in a closet somewhere, or is everything scattered? Can you leave projects out mid-process, or do you need to pack things up between sewing sessions? Here's what this looks like for me, and please keep in mind that this is my job, and the only people that depend on me are 2 beagles. At this point in my life, I have a dedicated sewing space in my house. We live in a Chicago bungalow, and I have the entire upstairs floor. This room here is where I sew, and there's another room across the staircase and landing that is my office. With this setup, I'm able to sew anytime I want or need to. In the past, I've had an office and a workspace outside the house. I've had dedicated rooms in my apartments. I once took over my entire apartment with work, and I've also had many times where I just had no dedicated space and would sew wherever I could. All of these had different pros and cons, and all of them required different organizational systems to function. So what's the point? Just notice where you sew and what the constraints are. We'll come back to this later when we're setting up organizational systems. The next question we're going to ask ourselves is, when do you actually sew? I don't mean when you wish you sewed, because I have very different answers for the 2 questions, but when does sewing actually happen for you? These are the patterns that I want you to notice. Do you sew in long stretches, short bursts, or somewhere in between? Is it scheduled time or spontaneous when inspiration hits? Are there certain times of year where you sew more? Do you ever find yourself wanting to sew, but the high barrier to setting up or getting ready stops you? Do you sew regularly, or do you go in phases where you sew a lot and then take a few weeks or months off? This varies a lot for me based on what's happening at work. Over the past year, my time has been spent sewing muslins for future patterns and doing a truly mind-numbing amount of administration and website work. This means I'm not sewing every day, but when I do sew, my space needs to be ready for me and I have set tasks that I need to accomplish. I also sew in shorter sessions because I like to try out a technique or see how something comes together, then think about it for a little bit before I commit to whatever I'm doing pattern-wise. Why does this matter? Understanding your actual sewing rhythm helps you figure out what kind of organization you need. If you sew frequently in short bursts, you might find it helpful to find solutions that keep everything accessible and ready to go. If you do less frequent, longer sessions, you might need more project organization so you can work on multiple things. But keeping your machine and tools ready to go at a moment's notice may be less important. Now let's look at what types of things you actually make and see what sort of patterns emerge. The questions to consider here are, Do you make lots of quick projects or do you prefer long-term makes? Do you sew from your stash or buy fabric on a per project basis? Do you like to batch sew your garments or do you prefer to sew one item at a time? Are you someone who finishes one thing before starting another, or do you like to have multiple projects going? I personally only like to have one or two projects going at a time. And this goes for knitting and sewing. I'm actually terrible at multitasking, and something about having unfinished projects really gives me a mental block, so I try to avoid that whenever possible. At the same time, I often have to put my personal projects away before they're finished because I need to sew something for work. I also love batch sewing for certain garments because I'm kind of a uniform dresser, meaning I like to wear the same style of garment all the time, usually a button-down shirt of some kind. So I will absolutely sew multiple of those in a row. Knowing this about myself means that I need an organizational system that will allow me to tuck my personal project away temporarily while I sew for work without things getting completely chaotic. The point here is that there's no right way to sew. Some people are very methodical, one project start to finish. Other people like having options based on how they're feeling when they sit down to sew. Neither is better, but knowing your pattern helps you organize in a way that supports how you actually work. Okay, now for the most important questions. What is already working in your current setup and what's causing friction? Let's start with the positive because I guarantee there are things you're already doing that are working well. Maybe you have a great system for storing patterns. Maybe your machine and iron are always set up and ready to go. Maybe you have one drawer that's perfectly organized and you can always find what you need. Notice what's working because we're not going to mess with those things. If it's working great, acknowledge it and leave it alone. Now, what's causing friction? What makes you avoid sewing or putting it off? Is it that you can't find your scissors when you need them, or you have them but they're dull? That you forget which patterns you own? Maybe your fabric is in 3 different locations and you can't see or remember what you have? Or maybe your machine needs maintenance and you keep putting it off. This is not about feeling bad. We've all got parts that just don't work, and it's about identifying the specific barriers so we can address them. Now for me, what was working was I had pretty good systems for storing patterns, fabric, thread, etc. And my equipment was set up both at work and at home, ready to sew. What wasn't working was that I was trying to sew in 2 different spaces, home and work. At some point, I got tired of buying 2 of everything. And additionally, sometimes I would work at home on the weekend, which resulted in me hauling patterns, muslins, and supplies back and forth, making it so I inevitably would forget something every time. Once I identified that as a specific problem, I could actually fix it rather than just feeling generally overwhelmed. So here's what I want you to do this week. Just notice. You don't have to fix anything yet. Notice where you sew, when you sew, what you make, what's working, and what's not. Maybe jot down a few notes if that helps, or just think about it while you're sewing this week. So that is it for week 1. No organizing, no fixing, just noticing how you actually sew. Understanding your actual sewing practice is the foundation for everything else we're going to do in this series. Next week, we'll be defining organized enough and setting our standards so that we don't get stuck in an organizational loop or burn out on this process. Remember, the goal here is not perfection. It's having a space that works for you. So leave a comment and tell me what you noticed this week about your sewing practice. Were there any surprises when you really thought about your patterns and habits? I'll see you here next Friday. Happy sewing!